This is my true story. I worked my whole life so my son could have everything I never did. I built a home, a business, and a future, all for him. But somewhere along the way, he forgot who helped him stand. One morning, he looked at me with disgust and said words I never thought I'd hear from my own blood. "Clean my toilet, old man." I stood there, silent, holding back tears. I obeyed, but I didn't forget. What I did next changed his life forever. Before I tell you, comment where you're watching from and subscribe so my story can reach more people. It started like any other morning. The house was quiet, except for the sound of dishes clinking in the kitchen. My son came out of his room, dressed in a suit, holding his coffee like he owned the place. He didn't look at me the way a son should look at his father. There was no warmth, no respect, just irritation. He walked straight past me toward the bathroom and stopped at the doorway. He pointed at the toilet and said, "Clean it, old man." His tone was cold, sharp, and filled with pride. I froze. I thought maybe I misheard him. But when he turned around, there was a smirk on his face that told me he meant every word. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stared at him, wondering where I went wrong. This was the same child I used to carry on my shoulders to the park, the same boy who cried when he scraped his knee, the same boy I had held during thunderstorms. And now he stood there, treating me like I was less than the dirt under his shoes. His wife was standing in the hallway behind him, holding her phone, pretending not to watch. When she heard him say those words, she didn't look shocked or upset. She laughed. That laughter hit harder than the insult. He tossed a cleaning brush at my feet and walked away, muttering something about how old people should be useful. I bent down slowly to pick it up. My hands trembled, not from weakness, but from humiliation. I wanted to yell, to remind him who paid for his college, who fed him when he was broke, who gave him the roof over his head. But I didn't. I just stood there, holding that brush like it weighed 100 pounds. The bathroom light buzzed above me. The tiles were cold under my feet. I could hear the faucet dripping, one slow drop at a time, and with each one, I felt something inside me break. I had worked for 40 years, built a small plumbing company from nothing, fixed thousands of toilets in other people's homes, and never once felt degraded. But standing in my own son's house, being told to clean his toilet, that was different. That wasn't work. That was punishment. I looked around the bathroom, the fancy marble counter, the expensive mirror, the gold-trimmed fixtures. All of it was built from the business I started. The same business I handed over to him when I retired, thinking he'd carry it forward with pride. Instead, he used it to fund a life that made him forget where he came from. Every part of that house was built on my effort, and now I was being treated like an unwanted guest in it. I didn't clean right away. I stood there for a long time, staring at the reflection in the mirror. My face looked tired, older than I remembered. I could see the man I used to be, strong, capable, respected. Now I just saw an old man with nothing left but memories of better days. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and took a deep breath. I thought about his mother and what she would have said if she were alive to see this. She would have cried. She always believed he had a good heart. Maybe he once did. But success had changed him. Money had made him cruel. When I finally moved, it wasn't out of obedience. It was out of disbelief. I grabbed a rag, turned on the faucet, and started wiping. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed time to think. The sound of water running covered my tears. He probably thought I was weak for not fighting back, but he didn't know me anymore. He didn't know what kind of man he was provoking. I had been patient all my life, patient enough to raise him, patient enough to survive losing his mother, and patient enough to wait for the right moment to teach him what real consequences feel like. I didn't say a word that morning. I didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't defend myself. I finished cleaning, washed my hands, and walked out of that bathroom quietly. But as I passed by the family photos on the wall, his wedding, his business opening, his new house, I knew something inside me had changed forever. The man who raised him was gone. The man who would ruin him had just taken his place. I went back to my small room after that. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the same shirt from the day before. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from something deeper. Disappointment. The kind of pain that doesn't shout. It just sits heavy inside your chest and eats away at you. I stared at my palms, the same ones that had built everything he owns. The house, the business, the life he was so proud of. They were wrinkled, rough, scarred from decades of work. I never cared about that before. But that morning, those scars felt like proof that I had wasted my strength on the wrong person. When I picked up that brush to clean his toilet, I didn't do it because I was weak. I did it because I was numb. I scrubbed until my knees hurt and my back screamed. The sound of the brush scratching against porcelain echoed in my head like punishment. Every stroke reminded me of something I gave him: his first car, his first down payment, the business license in his name. It all came back in flashes, each one hitting harder than the last. By the time I finished, my eyes were full of tears, and I didn't even notice them falling until they hit the floor. He walked past the bathroom once, glanced inside and said, "Finally doing something useful." Then he left. Just like that. No thank you, no smile, no sign that he saw me as anything more than a burden. I heard his wife laugh again in the living room. I don't think I've ever felt smaller in my own house. I leaned against the wall and slid to the floor. I didn't cry like a child. I cried like a man who'd just realized his life's work turned against him. For hours I sat there, staring at that same wall. I thought about all the nights I went hungry so he could eat, the winters I worked through snow and rain to keep the lights on, the days I went without sleep just to pay for his college tuition. Every sacrifice flashed in my mind, but none of it mattered anymore. My son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders, now looked at me like I was trash. At some point, the pain turned into something else: cold, quiet, controlled. I stopped crying and just sat still. That's when a strange calm came over me. My tears dried and my breathing slowed. I realized I wasn't powerless. He thought I was just some old man with nothing left. But he didn't know how much I still had in my name. He didn't remember that every paper in that house, from the deed to the business license, had my signature on it first. He might have forgotten, but the law hadn't. That night, when the house went dark, I didn't sleep. I sat in silence, listening to the wind outside the window. My eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling. I felt something inside me shift, the last piece of patience break away. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. The kind of done that comes after years of giving and being taken for granted. I decided that I wouldn't fight him with words. Words mean nothing to people like him. I would use the same thing he worshipped: money, power, control. In the morning, he came into my room and told me to take out the trash. I didn't even look at him. I just nodded, pretending to be tired, pretending to be the same broken man he thought I was. But in my mind, I was already somewhere else. In the bank, in the lawyer's office, in the past, where my name still held value. He didn't know it yet, but I was about to take back everything he thought belonged to him. When he left for work that day, I stood in front of the mirror again. My eyes were red, but my face looked calm. I wiped my tears and said nothing. I didn't need to. The man in the mirror wasn't broken anymore. He was planning. He was waiting. That's the day I changed. That's the day I realized my biggest mistake wasn't raising a disrespectful son. It was letting him think I had no power left. He'd soon learn how wrong he was. That night, after everyone went to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the life I'd lived for that boy. Every memory I had of him came back one after another. The small house we started in, the days when we had nothing but still found reasons to laugh, the long nights I spent fixing old plumbing pipes just to keep food on the table. I remembered the day he was born. I was just 24, holding him in my arms, scared but proud. His mother smiled and said, "He's going to be better than both of us." I believed her. For years, I worked toward that single promise, to make sure he'd never live the kind of hard life I did. When he was a kid, I'd come home covered in grease and dirt, but I never missed a single dinner with him. I taught him how to hold a wrench before he could even write his name. On weekends, we'd sit in the truck and drive around the city while I told him stories about work. I used to dream that one day he'd take over the business and make it bigger, smarter, cleaner. And when he was a teenager, that dream started to feel real. He'd help me fix leaks, talk about expansion plans, even come up with ideas on how to modernize everything. I thought we were building something together, a future, a legacy. But somewhere along the way, success changed him. After his mother passed away, everything shifted. He became colder, sharper, more focused on showing off than working hard. When he took over the company, I told myself to be proud, that my job as a father was done. But what I didn't realize was that I had handed him everything too soon. I gave him the keys before he learned the value of earning them. The more he gained, the less he respected where it came from. I remembered the day he bought his new house. He called me, not to thank me, but to brag. I stood in the living room while he walked me through every expensive thing he owned, the polished floors, the designer kitchen, the big glass windows. He smiled and said, "You wouldn't understand, Dad." This is what real success looks like. I didn't argue. I just nodded, pretending to be proud. But inside, I felt something break. It wasn't jealousy. It was sadness. Because I could already see the man he was becoming. After that, he stopped visiting me as often. When he did, it was usually to ask for something, a favor, a loan, or advice he'd never actually follow. He treated me like an old machine that had outlived its use. When I got sick one winter, he didn't come to the hospital. He sent a text saying he was busy closing a deal. That's when I realized I was no longer a father to him. I was just a memory he hadn't erased yet. I tried to understand him. I told myself maybe the world was different now. Maybe young people just cared more about money and success than family. But even that excuse stopped working the day he looked me in the eye and told me to clean his toilet. That wasn't modern life. That was cruelty. That was arrogance built on a foundation I laid. And it made me realize that all those years of love, sacrifice, and work meant nothing to him anymore. I thought about all the times I fixed his mistakes, the debts I paid when he failed his first business venture, the lawyer I hired when he got into trouble, the apartment I bought for him after his first divorce. I gave him everything, and every time I told myself, he'll learn now. But he never did. Instead, he took more, asked more, and gave less. Now looking back, I see how blind I was. I thought being a good father meant always forgiving, always giving, always understanding. But that was my biggest mistake. A good father doesn't just raise his child. He teaches him what it means to respect where he came from. I had done the first part. I had failed the second. When I sat in that bathroom cleaning his toilet, all those years came flooding back. Every sacrifice, every late night, every promise I made to his mother. And all of it ended right there, with a toilet brush in my hand and tears in my eyes. But that was the last time I let him treat me like that. The man he mocked for being old and weak was about to remind him who gave him his empire. And soon, he'd wish he never said those words. That same night, I sat at my desk in the small study room, the one nobody ever entered anymore. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, and the old lamp cast a yellow glow over a pile of forgotten papers. My hands were still sore from scrubbing the floor, but I didn't care. I opened the bottom drawer where I kept my old lockbox. Inside it was everything that still tied my name to the life I had built. The property deeds, company ownership documents, bank statements, and business registration files. Dust covered the top of the folder labeled Master Holdings. That name hadn't been spoken in years, not since I handed the reins of my plumbing business to my son. I gave it to him when I retired, thinking I was passing on a legacy. But that night, I realized I had only handed him power he didn't deserve. I sat there, going through each paper slowly. It felt strange touching them again after all these years. The ink was fading, but the names were still clear. My name, on every original file, every registration paper, every account opening form. His name only appeared later, added as a co-owner when he turned 30. I remember doing that to give him control, but I never actually transferred the full rights. He had always thought I did. That was his first mistake, assuming control meant ownership. The more I read, the more calm I felt. My anger started to fade into focus. Every insult, every moment he treated me like I was worthless, all of it pointed me toward one clear thought. I still had the power to change everything. He thought the house was his, the business was his, the cars, the accounts, all his. But the truth sat in front of me in black and white. My name wasn't gone. It was buried under his arrogance. By midnight, I had a plan. It wasn't revenge in the heat of anger. It was something colder, quieter, something a father does when love turns into a lesson. I decided I would take back everything that had my name on it. Not to hurt him, but to remind him that what he disrespected didn't come from nothing. I would remind him that every comfort he enjoyed came from a man he now called useless. The next morning, I woke early. I waited until he left for work before I called my lawyer, the same man who had been with me since the start of my business nearly 40 years ago. His name was Frank. He sounded surprised to hear my voice after so long. I told him I needed to meet that afternoon. It was urgent. He didn't ask questions. We agreed to meet at his office downtown at 3 p.m. I hung up, took a long shower, and looked at myself in the mirror again. My reflection looked older, but my eyes were sharper. For the first time in years, I felt awake. At the lawyer's office, I explained everything. The insult, the documents, the false assumption of ownership. Frank looked through the papers carefully. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You still hold majority control." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Majority control. Two small words that meant everything he owned could be taken back with a single signature. I signed the necessary forms right there. No hesitation. Every share, every property, every account that still bore my name would revert fully to me. When I left that office, the air outside felt different. It wasn't joy I felt. It was peace. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't angry. I wasn't crying anymore. I was just calm. He would never see it coming. That's what made it perfect. I didn't tell anyone. For the next few days, I acted like nothing had happened. I made breakfast, watered the plants, even greeted his wife politely when she walked past me without speaking. He bragged loudly about work calls and business meetings, thinking he was unstoppable. But behind his loud success was a quiet truth. His father was about to turn off the tap that filled his entire life. That week felt long, but I didn't rush. I waited with patience, the same patience that raised him, the same patience that built everything he had. I didn't need revenge that screamed. I needed one that taught. And by the time I was done, he'd understand that the man he humiliated was the same man who gave him everything he owned, and could take it all back just as easily. The next week felt slower than any I can remember. I woke up early each morning, cooked breakfast like I always did, and kept my head down. The house was quiet except for the noise he made. He talked loudly on the phone, bragging to clients about contracts and profits that didn't exist anymore. I kept my eyes on the newspaper and let him talk. Every word he said sounded hollow because I already knew that the company he was so proud of no longer belonged to him. The paperwork was done, the accounts were frozen. He just didn't know it yet. He acted like nothing had changed. He still barked orders, threw his shoes near the door, and demanded things like a king who thought the world revolved around him. His wife followed his lead, always watching me with that half smile, the kind that hides judgment behind politeness. I didn't give them the satisfaction of reacting. Every insult slid right past me. I cleaned, cooked, and stayed silent. But inside, I was counting the days. Each sunrise brought me closer to the moment they'd learn the truth. He invited friends over that week, some business partners, some people he wanted to impress. I stayed in my room most of the time, but I could hear everything. He laughed louder than usual, trying to show off. They talked about deals, cars, vacations, and money like it was air. At one point, I heard my name come up. One of his friends must have asked where I was. My son said, "Oh, the old man's around somewhere. He just doesn't do much anymore." Then they laughed. I sat on the bed, staring at the wall, letting the sound of that laughter burn into me. That was the last time I let his words hurt. After that, they became fuel. At dinner, I served them all like a quiet waiter. None of them said thank you. His wife looked at me and said, "You missed a spot." I nodded and wiped the table again. I wanted them to see a weak old man. I wanted them to think I had accepted my place. The more invisible I looked, the better my plan would work. I wasn't just silent, I was strategic. Silence is the strongest weapon when the other person thinks you've already surrendered. Each night when the lights went out, I'd sit by the window in my room, watching the glow from his office down the hall. He'd be in there on the phone, pacing, shouting about invoices and suppliers. I'd smile quietly, knowing those numbers meant nothing now. I had already transferred every asset, every property, every financial control back into my name. He was living in a house he didn't own, running a company that no longer existed under his control. And all of it looked perfectly normal from the outside. One night, I heard him tell his wife he was planning a big expansion deal, one that would require a large amount of company credit. I almost felt sorry for him. He didn't know that by the end of the week, those credit lines would bounce. He'd find out the hard way that his business empire was built on someone else's foundation, mine. I'd been patient all my life, but this time, patience was my revenge. On the 5th day, the first signs appeared. His phone started ringing nonstop. He ignored a few calls, then picked one up and left the room. His tone changed, nervous, uncertain. Later, he stormed into the kitchen, pacing back and forth. "Some system issue," he muttered. "The accounts are frozen." His wife asked if it was serious. He said no, but I could hear the crack in his voice. I didn't say a word. I just poured my tea and walked past him. That night, I slept better than I had in years. For the first time, I didn't feel powerless. I didn't feel humiliated. I felt calm. Not happy, not angry, just steady. The world had balanced itself again. The son who told me to clean his toilet was about to learn what it meant to clean up his own mess. The week ended like it began. Quietly. But under that silence, something huge had shifted. He was still walking around, pretending everything was fine. But I could see it in his eyes. The fear had started. The cracks had formed. And I didn't have to lift a finger or raise my voice. All I had to do was wait. Friday morning came. The air felt heavy in the house, like it knew something was about to happen. My son rushed down the stairs already on the phone, arguing with someone from the bank. His voice was loud, full of panic he was trying to hide. "It's just a system glitch," he said, pacing in circles. His wife stood by the counter, arms crossed, pretending to believe him. I sat at the table drinking my coffee, slow and calm. Every word he spoke reminded me that the trap I had set was working exactly as planned. After he stormed out, I dressed neatly, collared shirt, polished shoes, my old coat. I walked down to the lawyer's office again to finalize everything. The papers were already in motion, but today was the final signature, the one that sealed it all. When I arrived, Frank, my lawyer, had everything prepared. He looked at me and said, "Once you sign this, your son won't be able to touch anything tied to the company, properties, or trusts. Are you sure you want to go through with it?" I didn't hesitate. I said yes. I sat there for a long time after signing, staring at the ink drying on the page. It wasn't joy I felt. It wasn't revenge either. It was justice, quiet, clean, and overdue. For years I had been silent while he used everything I built to feed his ego. Now the scales were even. He'd learn what it felt like to start with nothing, the same way I once did. But this time, he'd have no one to blame. After the meeting, I stopped by the small cafe across the street. I ordered a sandwich and coffee, just like I used to years ago after closing big contracts for my business. The waitress, a kind young woman, smiled and said, "You look like you just won something." I smiled back and said, "I guess you could say that." Then I took my time finishing the meal. I wasn't rushing. I didn't need to. Everything was already done. By the time I got home, his car was parked outside. I could hear him yelling inside before I even reached the door. He was on the phone again, shouting at someone from his company's finance team. "What do you mean the accounts are under review?" he screamed. His wife looked pale. Papers were scattered across the living room floor. Bank statements, letters, legal notices. The panic had finally arrived. He turned to me the moment I walked in. His eyes were wide, full of confusion. "Dad," he said, "something's wrong with the business." I looked at him calmly. "Is it?" I said, pretending not to know. He nodded quickly, desperate. "The accounts, the ownership, even the house, it's like it's not mine." I didn't answer right away. I just sat down, took off my coat and said, "That's strange." Then I watched as realization started to dawn on his face. He knew. He didn't want to admit it yet, but deep down, he knew. He spent the next few hours on calls, pacing, shouting, trying to find answers. Every time he thought he fixed one problem, another one showed up. By evening, he was sitting on the couch, face pale, eyes blank. His wife was crying quietly. I made myself tea and turned on the radio. The sound of calm music filled the room, a sharp contrast to the chaos in his world. At 7 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Frank. He said, "It's official. Everything's processed. Your son no longer has any legal ownership of the company, the vehicles, or the properties. The accounts are under your sole authority again." I thanked him, hung up, and looked at my son. He was still staring into space. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him, but then I remembered the toilet, the brush, and his words. "Do something useful, old man." That's when I realized something. This wasn't just about money or revenge. This was about balance. For years, he thought power came from shouting louder and standing taller. But true power comes from patience, from knowing when to move and when to wait. And I had waited long enough. That night, I went to bed early. I could hear him downstairs, whispering to his wife, his voice cracking for the first time in years. He was afraid, not of losing money, but of facing the truth. Everything he had wasn't really his. It was mine all along, and now it was mine again. I slept peacefully for the first time in a long time. The man who told me to clean his toilet had finally learned what real cleaning felt like, wiping away the mess his pride made. The next morning started quiet. Too quiet. Usually, I'd hear him stomping down the hallway, barking orders on his phone before breakfast. But that day, the house was still. When I walked into the kitchen, he was already sitting at the table. His hair was messy, his eyes red from not sleeping. A pile of papers sat in front of him. Bank notices, legal forms, and company letters. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of his arrogance had finally crushed him. His wife sat beside him, staring down at her coffee, not saying a word. The silence between them said enough. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine. They weren't angry like before. They were scared. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His voice had no strength left. I sat across from him, calm and steady. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth was already written all over his face. For a few minutes, nobody said anything. The clock ticked. The fridge hummed. The air felt thick, like the house itself knew this was the day everything turned. Finally, he broke the silence. "Dad," he said, his voice barely holding together, "what did you do?" He said it softly, not in anger, but in disbelief. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "I cleaned your mess." That was all I said. He frowned, confused at first. Then I saw it hit him. His face changed, realization spreading like a crack in glass. "You," he whispered, but the words stopped there. I could see it in his eyes. He knew I was the one who had pulled the strings. He pushed back his chair and stood up, pacing. His hands were shaking. "You ruined everything," he said. "My business, my home, my—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. He couldn't say "my father" because he knew he hadn't treated me like one. I stood up slowly and looked him in the eye. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shouting. My voice stayed even. "No," I said. "You ruined everything when you forgot who gave it to you." He sat back down, slumped, defeated. His wife left the table quietly and walked to their room, leaving us alone. I could hear her crying faintly through the wall. My son rubbed his forehead, staring down at the papers. "What am I supposed to do now?" he said quietly. I didn't answer right away. I let him sit in his own silence, the same silence I had lived with for years while he mocked me. I wanted him to feel it, to understand the weight of what he'd done. After a long pause, I said, "You'll start again. From the beginning. Like I did." He looked up, eyes full of disbelief. "But how?" he asked. I shrugged. "The same way I built everything you took for granted. With your hands." He lowered his head. There was no fight left in him. The man who once called me useless now sat there like a child who finally realized he wasn't invincible. For the first time in years, I saw something familiar in his face. Not pride, not arrogance, but shame. Real, heavy shame. It wasn't satisfying to see, it was painful. Because even after everything he did, he was still my son. But that's the thing about respect. Once it's gone, it doesn't return easily. It has to be earned again, one small action at a time. He asked me if I would undo what I did, if I could give the business back, reopen the accounts, make things right again. I told him I could. Then I told him I wouldn't. "This is your lesson," I said simply. "You wanted power. Now you'll learn what happens when power forgets its roots." He looked at me, speechless. Then, for the first time, he nodded. Not out of agreement, but out of defeat. When he left the room, I stayed seated. I could hear the front door close behind him. The house fell silent again. I finished my coffee and stared out the window. The same sun that rose on the day he disrespected me was shining again, only this time it felt warmer. Not because I'd won, but because I'd taken back my dignity. He didn't come home that night, or the night after. The next time I saw him, weeks later, he looked thinner, quieter, older. The arrogance was gone. Maybe it was life teaching him what I couldn't for all those years. Maybe it was the moment he finally understood that every empire can fall, especially the ones built on disrespect. That morning in the kitchen was the last time I saw him as the man he was. After that, he became someone else, someone learning humility the hard way. And that's exactly what he needed to become the man I once hoped he'd be. It didn't take long for everything to collapse after that morning. Within days, the phone calls started coming one after another. I could hear his voice through the walls, trying to stay calm while talking to banks, suppliers, and old partners. But there's only so long a man can pretend before reality shows up at his door. The money was gone. The contracts were gone. The trust people once had in his name vanished like smoke. I watched it happen in silence, the same silence he once threw at me when I tried to help him. Now he was the one being ignored. At first he tried to fight it. He blamed everyone. The accountant, the lawyers, even the system. But deep down, he knew exactly what happened. He knew that the man he called old and useless was the same man who had just pulled the rug out from under him. He stopped eating at the table, stopped going to the gym, stopped smiling. His wife stopped pretending too. Their arguments filled the house, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. She accused him of ruining everything, and she wasn't wrong. A few weeks later, I saw her packing her things. She didn't even look at me on her way out. She just slammed the door, got into her car, and drove away without a word. After that, the house changed. It felt emptier, quieter, colder. My son stayed in his room most of the time, blinds drawn, phone always in his hand. I could tell he was calling people, begging, negotiating, trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. But nobody wanted to talk to him anymore. The same people who once laughed at his jokes now ignored his calls. That's how the world works. Respect doesn't vanish because of bad luck. It vanishes because of bad character. And his character had finally caught up with him. One afternoon, I walked past his office. The door was open. He was sitting there with his head in his hands, surrounded by piles of paper. He didn't notice me. I stood there for a few seconds, just watching. Part of me wanted to say something, to offer comfort. But another part of me remembered the toilet brush, the laughter, the way he had looked at me like I was nothing. That memory kept me quiet. He needed to sit in that silence, the same silence he once gave me. By the end of the month, he had lost everything. The company was officially closed. The house was under my name again. The cars were repossessed. His credit cards were canceled. Every part of his life that screamed success was stripped away, layer by layer, until only the man remained. No titles, no power, no pride. He tried to find work, but no one would hire him. People had heard the story. They knew how he treated the man who built his life for him. Nobody wanted to work with someone like that. He came to me one evening, standing at the doorway of my room. His voice was low, shaky. "Dad," he said, "I need help." I didn't turn around right away. I let the words hang in the air, heavy and uncertain. When I finally looked at him, he wasn't the same man who once barked orders. He was just a son, tired, broken, and lost. I didn't shout. I didn't scold. I just said, "Help starts with humility." Then I turned off the lamp and went to bed. After that night, he packed a bag and left. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. For months, I didn't hear from him. Sometimes I wondered where he was sleeping, whether he was eating, whether he'd finally learned. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I had carried him my whole life, and now he'd have to learn to stand on his own. Word got around town fast. People whispered about what happened, how the successful businessman had lost it all, how the old man had taken back everything. Some people called it revenge. I called it balance, because what I did wasn't out of hate, it was out of fairness. He had treated me like dirt, and I had simply shown him what it felt like to live without the foundation I built. Months passed. One day, I saw him walking down the street near the post office. His clothes were worn, his face pale, but there was something different in his eyes, a quietness I hadn't seen in years. He looked at me from a distance, hesitated, then nodded once before walking away. That small nod was enough. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't an apology. But it was something. It was the start of him finally understanding. That's when I knew the fall was complete. He had lost everything, except the chance to change. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only thing I ever wanted him to find. The house was quiet again, just like it used to be before he moved in. Only this time, the quiet didn't hurt. It felt peaceful. I woke up every morning at 6, made coffee, and sat on the porch to watch the sun rise over the trees. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking on eggshells in my own home. I wasn't being ordered around, mocked, or ignored. I could hear birds again instead of shouting. The silence wasn't loneliness anymore. It was freedom. I started fixing things around the house that he never bothered to touch. The broken fence, the leaky faucet, the loose tiles in the hallway. All the things I had built decades ago, and he let fall apart. It was strange how doing those small repairs made me feel alive again. I realized I didn't need a company or wealth or approval to have purpose. I just needed peace. The neighbors started stopping by more often. Some of them had heard the story, but they never brought it up directly. They just said things like, "It's good to see you out again," or "You look healthier lately." I'd smile and offer them coffee, pretending not to notice the curiosity behind their eyes. People always want to know how something so big fell apart, but they never ask out loud. They just whisper later, and that's fine with me. Let them talk. I wasn't ashamed of what happened. I did what I had to do. Every now and then, I'd think about my son. I wondered where he was, what kind of job he found, whether he was still angry or if time had softened him. Sometimes I'd pick up my phone and stare at his old number saved in my contacts. I never called. I figured if he wanted to talk, he'd call me. But he didn't. Weeks turned into months. The house stayed quiet, the porch stayed peaceful, and I stayed steady. Then one day, I got a letter. It didn't have a return address, but I knew the handwriting the second I saw it. It was shaky, uneven, but it was his. I opened it carefully. Inside, there was just a single sheet of paper. It said, "I'm working again. Not much, but honest. I'm sorry for everything. I'm trying to be better. Thank you for what you taught me, even if it hurt." There was no signature, no phone number, no address. Just that. I sat with that letter for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I just felt complete. Maybe that was his way of saying he finally understood. Maybe that was the closure I didn't know I needed. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in my old lockbox, the same one I used to keep the business papers that took everything back. This time, I wasn't locking away revenge. I was locking away peace. The seasons passed quietly. I got older, slower, but I never felt bitter. I started taking walks in the evenings, greeting people, watching kids ride their bikes down the street. Life became simple again, the way it used to be before success, pride, and greed poisoned everything. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch at sunset and imagine my son walking up the road, maybe with a tired smile, maybe ready to talk. I didn't need an apology. I just wanted to know he had learned. I don't know where he is now. Maybe still working somewhere small, maybe starting fresh, maybe with a family of his own. But wherever he is, I hope he finally understands what real wealth looks like. Not cars, not houses, not company shares. Real wealth is knowing you earned everything you have and respecting the people who helped you get there. Now, when I clean my bathroom, I think about that day. The day he told me to clean his toilet. I remember how small I felt then, how broken. But now, it makes me smile. Because in the end, I did clean something. Not porcelain, not floors, but my life. I cleaned it of disrespect, pride, and people who forgot their roots. And it shines better than any bathroom ever could. It's strange how quiet a house can feel when the noise that used to hurt you is finally gone. I sit in this chair most evenings now, the same one I once used to watch my son play outside when he was a kid. The world feels smaller but calmer. The bitterness I used to carry is gone. I don't replay the words anymore. Clean my toilet, old man. They used to echo in my head every night, but now they sound like something said to another person in another lifetime. Maybe that's what time does. It doesn't erase the past, but it dulls the edges enough so you can hold it without bleeding again. When I think back on everything, I don't see myself as a victim. I see myself as a father who finally learned when to stop giving. I spent most of my life believing love meant sacrifice, that no matter how many times your child disrespected you, you just kept forgiving, kept helping, kept fixing. But now I know better. Love doesn't mean letting someone walk all over you. It means teaching them what respect costs, even if the lesson hurts both of you. What I did wasn't revenge. It was correction. It was a line drawn after years of letting him step over every boundary I had. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far, if taking everything back was cruel. But then I remember the look in his eyes that morning at the table, when he realized the house, the company, the cars. None of it was his anymore. That look wasn't pain. It was realization. The first time in his adult life that he understood what responsibility feels like. That's the moment he started becoming a man again. And if it took me destroying his illusion to rebuild his character, then I can live with that. I've thought about calling him, especially on holidays. I even picked up the phone a few times, but I always put it back down. It's not pride, it's peace. I know he needs time. Time to figure out who he is without the safety net I gave him. A father's job doesn't always end with raising a child. Sometimes it ends with stepping away and letting the world teach what you couldn't. Maybe he'll come back someday. Maybe he won't. Either way, I'll be here, not waiting, but ready. I still keep the business running, smaller now, quieter. I hired 2 apprentices from town, good young men who remind me of how my son used to be before pride took over. I teach them the way I taught him once, about work, honesty, respect. Every time they call me sir, it feels different now. Not because I need the title, but because I earned it again. It reminds me that dignity doesn't come from money or position. It comes from how you live and how you demand to be treated. I don't tell people the full story when they ask about my son. I just say, he's finding his way. That's enough. There's no need to expose his mistakes to strangers. The lesson was between him and me, and that's where it will stay. But I'll tell you this much. The day he comes back, if he does, I won't turn him away. I won't forget what he did, but I'll remember that he was once a boy who needed guidance, and I'll be ready to offer it. Not as a doormat, but as a father who finally knows his worth. Now, when I look around this house, I don't see ghosts of anger or regret. I see peace. I see survival. I see proof that even when people push you to the ground, you can still stand taller than them by staying calm and choosing your moment. He thought telling me to clean his toilet made me powerless. But all it did was remind me of who really built the foundation under his feet. I took back what was mine, and in doing so, I took back myself. He told me to clean. So I did. I cleaned the mess he made of my trust, my dignity, and our family's name. I cleaned my life until it shined again. He said I was old and useless. But I was the storm he never saw coming.